Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. You're watching Grit TV. In August of this year, Judge Shira Shendlin ruled that New York's so-called Stop-and-Frisk policing program was unconstitutional and racially biased. Since, the city has filed an appeal, and in an unusual move, Judge Shendlin was pulled off the case. Now, change is delayed. A ruling isn't expected for months, even as a new mayor comes into office whose victory owes a good deal to his pledge to eliminate stop and frisk. What's all of this say about social justice in 2013 and beyond? How far have we come? What have advocates learned about what they're up against and how they work? Joo-Hyun Kang is director of Communities United for Police Reform. She's here to discuss all that and ponder a little bit just what justice for everybody in a city like New York might look like. Joo-Hyun, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
So let's start by going back to an event that I think a lot of people who have been paying attention to this issue might remember, an event that you took a certain amount of a lead in, and that was an extraordinary demonstration in the spring of 2012 on Father's Day against stop and frisk.
Communities United for Police Reform is extremely proud to be standing with National Action Network, NAACP, and 1199, and all the other partners who are working to build this historic march against stop and frisk and against racial profiling. And part of what we see this moment as is a moment where there's a significant and severe civil rights crisis in this city that exemplifies racial profiling at its worst. If not that there's any good racial profiling, but certainly identifies it as its worst. But what we think and what we believe is that on June 17th, with all of our communities standing together, we will not only have a historic mobilization, but this will be the largest mobilization we've seen against NYPD abusive practices and for specifically NYPD accountability and against racial profiling in New York City for over a decade at minimum.
Part of what we saw in the past few years is that with the explosion of the massive stop and frisk regime is what we would call it under Mayor Bloomberg. What we saw was almost a 600% or over 600% increase in stops.
So just underscore that a little bit. I mean, this is a program that was actually begun under Giuliani.
Absolutely.
And it was part of his, getting tough on small crimes, cleaning up the city. Why did it come to be called a kind of Bloomberg signature program?
Under Giuliani, I mean, I think it's really important to underscore what you said, which is that in many ways the explosion of stop and frisk definitely started under Giuliani. But I think what ended up happening under Bloomberg is that we started to have access to data, which we didn't really have access to under Giuliani. And simultaneously, even under Giuliani, there was maybe upwards of 90, 100,000 documented stops a year. Under Bloomberg, we saw those stops rise to almost 700,000 a year. So that in 2011, one of the most unbelievable statistics is that there were more stops of young black men than there were young black men living in New York City. And that in and of itself, even if you knew nothing else, would make you think, even someone who might not really think about police accountability would make you think that there's really something wrong with the picture.
And how did you come to this issue, given your background in, Asian American politics and anti-war politics and LGBT politics? You'd headed up a LGBT center for people of color in Brooklyn for many years. How did you come to be heading up this Communities United for Police Reform?
I think some of it goes back to the work within LGBT communities and around racial justice. In many ways, the LGBT movement owes its founding, at least in the United States, to what people talk about as Stonewall, which, regardless of how people talk about that history, was really an uprising and a rebellion against police repression of LGBT people. And so in many ways, the history of LGBT movements comes out of that and the regulation of gender norms in the United States. But also while I was at the Audre Lorde Project, I had the really great opportunity of working on issues of police brutality and working to fight for justice for families and working with mostly organizations based in communities of color who were doing work around unjustified killings of unarmed people by the NYPD and not having accountability for those. So whether that was Amadou Diallo, whether that was the torture of Abner Louima, Anthony Baez, and then even in the LGBT community, the brutal beating of Jalila Lamott and her family. Simply because they were living in public housing, and we think because they were living in public housing and people of color, the cops who brutalized them in the mid-90s thought that they could get away with it.
Tell people a little bit about that story in case they don't remember.
Sure. It's a case where Jalila Lamott was a young transgender woman. Her mother was worried about her health one day, and so she called for emergency services. And when the cops actually came, transit authority cops, and when they actually approached Jalea, they first spoke to her as you would speak to anyone, and then when they realized that she was a transgender woman, became really homophobic, and actually started to beat on her. They beat the dog in the family. They beat family members. It was a pretty brutal attack, and all because the mother was actually concerned about the health of her daughter.
And that's not an isolated incident.
Not
we're
by any
finding out
means.
when it comes to people calling for police help and then finding themselves on the receiving end of abuse.
Which is one of the reasons why many community members throughout different neighborhoods in New York City don't rely on the NYPD for assistance in emergency situations, which is a horrible way to have a city run.
So how does this movement intersect with the movement that grew up after 9/11 around the profiling of Muslim Americans, the Muslim community, the profiling of Arab Americans, and those mass detention sweeps that we saw in the wake of the attack on the trade towers?
You know, I think it's all part of what racial profiling looks like in this country. Before 9/11, what had happened right before 9/11 actually was a UN World Conference Against Racism. And prior to that, there had been this national consensus that was growing against racial profiling in the United States. After 9/11 and the tragedy of many people's lives being lost, what we saw was really a shift towards not being able to criticize the police or law enforcement for anything and having a lot of fear-mongering happen. So I think that what we're seeing right now in terms of the unjustified and blanket surveillance of Muslim communities is really, you know, the other side of the coin of racial profiling.
So here we are at the end of 2013, having scored a major win, it seemed, this August when Judge Sheindlin said what she said and called for there to be really pretty far-reaching remedies. And then the appeal by the city, but also the new mayor. Where do we stand right now, in your view, as this year ends up? The new mayor has yet to take office. How do we make, as a social justice movement, this issue more than just a campaign point on the new mayor's platform?
Sure, I think that when we reflect back on 2013, one of the things we have to remember in terms of police accountability is that we scored victories not only in the courtroom, but also in the legislature. So the city council passed 2 landmark pieces of legislation to help to increase NYPD accountability. One was to create an office of the Inspector General to oversee the NYPD, and secondly was to actually ban all types of discriminatory profiling by the NYPD. That, in combination with Judge Sheindlin's ruling, an order for remedies, gives us this tremendous opportunity to really build on the grassroots power that was developed over the past 2 years and longer in terms of the history of this issue, and to move into this next period with a mayor who's more open to the idea, certainly, of having the NYPD treat all New Yorkers with respect and dignity, and recognizing that safety doesn't have to be at the cost of respect and dignity for all people. So I think that our job as activists is to make sure that that doesn't turn into, just as you said, something for a campaign, but that we maintain momentum. And I think that what we saw in the past year is that New Yorkers from all boroughs of the city are concerned about what they see as wrongful policing and policing that's counterproductive to safety, so that it's not just about, for those who might dismiss civil liberties or civil rights, it's not just about rights, it's actually also about safety, that safety won't be guaranteed unless all New Yorkers are treated with dignity by law enforcement.
And what do you make of the lame duck mayor, Mayor Bloomberg's pushback so hard?
You know, I think he's a sore loser is part of it. And maybe that's not the best thing to say, but it's really unfortunate when you've got, in so many ways, New Yorkers across the political spectrum, across race, across class in New York saying that we actually need change. We need reform to this abuse and massive explosion of stop-and-frisk. And him actually continuing to turn out NYPD propaganda, making it seem as if stop-and-frisk is the only thing that will keep New York safe, which there's no evidence proving that. He's never been able to point to any kind of research. And in fact, the research shows that what it does actually is alienate and criminalize entire generations of New Yorkers who will never call the cops for assistance.
But we have a city picture, and then we have a national picture. And as our colleagues at Grit TV, Kim Crenshaw and Devin Carbato wrote in the New York Times this summer, the ending of stop and frisk at the local level doesn't mean that it can't continue, because it's actually kind of been okayed by the Supreme Court.
Sure.
At the level of precedent over
Sure,
the
and I
last
think
many
that
years.
for us, what we've not called for the end of all stops. So certainly if there, and the legal definition of a stop, or when there's justification for a stop, is that if an officer sees a crime being committed or believes that a crime has just been committed or is about to be committed. That's not how young people are being stopped. Right. Young people are being stopped on their way to the store getting milk for their grandmother.
But are you concerned that at the Supreme Court level there seems to be, since 9/11, such a willingness to accept suspicion as a justifiable premise for a stop?
Sure, the willingness of any level of government to not hold itself accountable, not hold other parts of government is going to be of concern to anybody in the United States who has any concern with justice or safety or community. And I think that, going back to one of your earlier questions, I think that our task is really to use this opportunity as a moment to really let democratic participation be fostered and promoted. That what we saw with the victories this past August, both in terms of the court ruling as well as in terms of the city council laws, is that New Yorkers, when you provide opportunities for them to organize and mobilize their neighbors, they will do so because they know that the city matters to them. And if there's opportunities for New Yorkers to really shape what their government looks like and what their safety looks like, then we'll do so.
Well, but first we have to know how our government works.
Absolutely.
I suspect that you've learned a thing or two about that in this year.
Learned a few things, absolutely. I've learned probably much more than I thought I would. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that the more transparent we are about how government works and the more transparent we are about what government does and doesn't do, the more everyday New Yorkers can take responsibility. And so part of what that looks like is that when we talk about safety, we need to talk about not just law enforcement's role in safety, but our co-production of safety and how people in our neighborhoods are, just as if I saw a neighbor who was being beaten up, I would want to intervene. That could be by another neighbor. But if I saw a neighbor being beaten up by law enforcement, I would want to intervene. And if that were happening to me, I would want my neighbor to intervene. And so that could be through just observing to maintain safety, to observe and document what's happening in terms of the police misconduct, but also sharing that taping with the neighbor. And we're seeing that more and more.
Now, how does the LGBT community grapple with that in the sense that many of us have felt too spied on for too long? Sure. Our privacy is precious. Sure, I want lots of eyes on the street when it comes to people who might be committing acts of violence, but I also know the feeling of being a teenager who doesn't want those eyes on me.
Sure, and I don't think that we're calling for, or I know that we're not calling for additional surveillance. I think what we're calling for is for all of us to take care of each other. And, that's really about expressing love for our neighbors. That's not about necessarily spying on them. It's certainly not about asking the government to spy on us further, but it's about saying that actually we care about what happens on our block. We care to make sure that law enforcement can't just brutalize or stop young people or older folks or workers coming home from the hospital simply because they need to meet a quota.
So as you go into the next year and the next stage of all of this organizing, assuming that the situation on Stop and Frisk in New York will play out in the courts in a positive way, what's the next stage of this? And how do you bring the lessons that you've learned both in terms of organizing and messaging and demands to a bigger stage?
I think a few things. One is that even assuming that the remedies process of the court ruling moves forward, and once the new laws go into effect in 2014, we still have a lot of work to do around education and implementation. And with any social justice work, we're going to need to see that actually the laws get implemented well, the orders get implemented well. And I expect that it's going to take us a decade to actually see full cultural change. We're seeing some cultural change right now, but we know that the law is a tool. It won't be the solution or the final solution. And so part of what we think we learned this past year was that it actually requires us to have some level of laser focus around what kind of objectives we're trying to secure. And one of those objectives is to make sure that we create a culture of safety where New Yorkers really do take care of each other and hold the police accountable for misconduct.
And how important, I should say, our mutual friend Scott Nakagawa wouldn't forgive me if I didn't ask you how important Asian Americans specifically are to this mobilization. Because when you think police brutality, it's not usually an Asian face on the victim, at least not the stories that hit the headlines. And yet we've seen real involvement this campaign.
Absolutely, and I think that there's a few things I would say. One is that, one of the reasons I got involved in anti-police brutality work was the killing of Joo-Hyun in the mid-90s.
Remind people about that story.
And he was a young man who was killed, like many other young men of color during the mid to late 90s. There were young men of color who were unarmed being killed pretty frequently in ways that there was no accountability for many of these cases. And so that Joo-Hyun was an Asian case, but he was in the context of race and class in terms of how different, especially low-income neighborhoods of color, immigrant communities of color were being treated by the police. In terms of Asians in New York City right now, we're seeing that Asians are close to a growing population, close to 13% of New York City's population. Communities of color are definitely becoming a majority and are a majority in the city, and certainly becoming a majority in the country.
And that could change this whole picture?
We hope so. I think that that's going to take some organizing to be continued. And part of what we think will happen is that not only are Americans recognizing more and more that racial justice is a core issue that needs to be dealt with, and actually racial inequality is a core issue that needs to be dealt with. But during this period, we're also, there are contradictions. There are folks who think that we're in a post-racial society. I don't think the evidence bears that out in any way, and I think that the more we're able to unite people around a vision that actually is about racial justice, the better off we'll be.
Joo-Hyun, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Laura.